Okay, we are going to analyze a cone beam CT scan of the cervical spine based on the Blair upper cervical chiropractic protocol. The first thing we're going to do is come up here and find the 2D viewer and go to orientation and flip horizontal. You don't need to do this, but if you're going to be sending images to another chiropractor, you probably want to, just to make sure that the left and the right are on the left, the reading left and the reading right, as is typical for chiropractic views. Now, what we're going to do is come up here and hit 3D MPR. If you do this after you horizontally flip, then when you get the three images, you'll have to flip each one individually. So this way it'll do all of it. Now, some of these CT scans in the Horos software will come up like this, and according to my research, the correct thing to select here is resample. So we'll hit that. Wait a second. Boom. Okay. Now what we need to do is we are going to center everything. So we use the ear canals for measurements because we can see those when we're looking at the x-rays. So let's go find the ear canals, and we're going to set things. Looks like I kind of got things good there. So we're going to look at the tilt, which with regular x-rays we look at the eyes. Don't always get the eyes. We would on this one. We could look at the eyes, but we might as well just use the ears, the ear canals. We're already using the ear canals. I've just got it going straight down the center of each ear canal and kind of hitting the bottom of the skull on each side there. And then I'm going to make sure it's kind of in the center. I look at the internal occipital protuberance there where the tissues are pulling that into a point, and kind of look here. I've noticed that the face often is not exactly square to the calvarium, and so I really want to look at the skull mostly. All right, so now we're looking here. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to hit this button, the angle button, and we are going to look at the center of each of those lines and line it up with the ground. Good. All right. So compared to the ground, the atlas plane line is 19.1 degrees. I will go ahead at this point and take a picture of that. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to change this to a 10 millimeter slice. Right now it's on the minimum 3, and I have to change this to mean, otherwise it comes up with a kind of a 3D view, but Horos doesn't do 3D very well. We're going to recenter things. What I'm actually going to do now is just so that I can go back to this point at some point in the future, so I'm going to hit the point tool. With Horos, if you move things around, most of the lines that you draw disappear. So, but these points don't. So I'm going to put one there on the front and on the that's not what I wanted to do. Back there and the back. Okay, if you hit the space bar, you can get rid of these other lines, which is sometimes useful. But more importantly than that, I'm going to put one here. Now, when I thickened the slice, the ear canals kind of disappeared. Oh, there they are. They're just down a little bit lower. So I'm going to go ahead and lower that. Good, so that center line is about where I put it before. Now let's move these in here somewhere. I'm just going to put it kind of at the edge of this is just so that I can quickly get back to this point. If I hit this little button up here, the reset button, it'll take me back to completely centered. But of course, we just took out the rotation and the tilt. This guy didn't have a lot of tilt. But we took out the rotation and the tilt. I don't want to have to redo that every time. Okay, now we're going to scroll down until we get in there and take a look. So we're looking, there's the foramen magnum. In this particular patient, it's fairly centered and front to back. It's not turned. And we're going to come down. Now, what Dr. Blair did, of course, was come up underneath the chin to look at these things. So he would come in at about a 45-degree angle here, not necessarily square to this, and he developed an algorithm for us to determine the convergence angles of the atlanto-occipital joints, or the condyle specifically. Well, we can develop a procedure later to maybe do that better, but the easy thing to do right here, okay, come out of there. I don't want any more. Oh, actually, but if I hit that, there we go. Now, I don't want to do too much rotation of a bunch of different things because that's going to start distorting the picture. It's hard to get back to normal, but we can come about right here. Now we're along the atlas plane line. Now what Dr. Blair did, I'm going to get rid of this, is he would find this notch. Now this notch wasn't usually this easy to see because we wouldn't be coming in straight on FOSS to C1. So that is an issue that we're going to have to figure out. What we're trying to find is the long axis of this. Now, that's important for two reasons. Number one, we want to look straight down that long axis so that we can see this outside edge right out here. And we can look at that outside edge along that angle, and we can see if the atlas and the skull are lined up. If we're here, we're looking at the back because we're coming straight in from the back. So you see this yellow line, we're coming straight in here. This person has a fairly straight line back here, but the back is not the best place to see. The mirror image usually occurs anterolateral aspect right in here. So if I saw a misalignment here, I would just ignore it. So how are we going to find this? Well, to use Dr. Blair's protocol, which, as I said, may not be the best, is we're going to put a dot in there. And then he would find the where the foramen magnum would overlay the lateral mass here. Well, a lot of doctors have found that this point here seems to be okay. I'm not too comfortable with that at this point. We need to do some more tests because I think we're going to find that with all the things that he couldn't do that we can, this is probably not the best way to find it. And we're going to hit that out there. Now we want a 90-degree angle, so I'm going to follow this margin of the lateral mass until I get it pretty close to 90. Now we're going to do the same thing here. I'm going to overlay, boom, come back up here, good, boom. All right, we got 8. Well, I'm going to leave that right there. That's pretty close. Okay, now I'm going to find my points. Remember I said how things move if we move things around. So I'm going to bisect that line and that line with these permanent points. And that's going to be my convergence angle. I'll measure it in a moment, but let's go back here and do the same thing. Good. Okay. A little messy. Outside edge. Now, if you actually see the margin of the joint up here, then you want to ignore it. You want to find the lateral most margin of the of the lateral mass. Let's move this to 20 and see what happens. My computer's going to work harder. Okay, we're still looking pretty good there. All right, I'm not too happy with this down here. Let's get that right in there. Good, we got a 92, so I'm going to bring that in just a hair. You may say we're nitpicking. In fact, one of the things I can do initially is just bring that up. Okay, now let's bisect those two lines. Interesting. That's not what I wanted to grab. Okay, well, let's move that out of the way. Get that. Just wanted to center that just a bit more. Okay. All right, now let's measure the actual convergence angle. So we constructed this blue line between the external auditory meatuses, and so I'm going to measure it compared to that, and we're going to look at that line perpendicular. So the yellow line, which is 90 degrees to that blue line, and that's what we're going to measure this to. So let's just line it up. Okay, so we have a convergence angle of 18.6 degrees, a little on the shallow side. Let's come in here. Good. A lot of times I'll take those out. You hit the space bar to do that, just so I don't accidentally grab it, because if you grab the middlemost line here, you can see how this turns into a rotating. Now suddenly everything turns and you've lost all that work you did, and you have to go back. Ask me how I know. Oh, look at that. That was pretty good. Pretty straight. All right. Convergence angle, basically 21 degrees. Now I'm going to hit Shift and select both and take a screenshot of that. Okay. Now, we want to measure the convexity angles, but we want to measure the convexity angles and the slope angles in this case to the ground. And when Dr. Blair was taking these pictures, he would level out the head when he was taking the base posterior, and no rotation, of course. But then when he was doing the modified protracto views, the Blair protracto views, he would have the person go into their normal natural head carriage. So if they had a big tilt and he was measuring the right one through here, then he'd be measuring it to the ground. I'm not sure why, and we can do better now. We can measure it to the skull itself and straighten things out, but right now this is the way we do it. Until we've done the studies like Dr. Blair did. He did study, and then he would change things based on experimentation, not on theory. The theory would guide his experiments, and then he would base things after that. So what we're going to do now, all these lines are going to disappear, but my dots aren't. And I'm going to go ahead and get out of the 20 millimeter range and just go back to the 10, just so my computer's not working quite so hard. I'm going to bring it back up here to kind of straighten it out. Actually, I probably could have just straightened it out right where it was, because I'm trying to get it to the floor. Good. Bring it back down. All right, now I'm looking in the center, and now I can see. Now you're not seeing the nice joints, but you can still see where the joints start and stop, or at least where the angles are. So now I'm going to come over here. Boom. Now we're too far forward. We don't want to be looking at the anterior margin. We want to be looking at the anterolateral margin. So I'm going to back this up just a bit. And right now all I'm doing is I'm going to be measuring. I'm not going to actually analyze the joint unless it's really clear to see. I'm not going to analyze the joint at this point because I may want to move things around a little bit. But in order to do the adjustment, the way that Dr. Blair showed us how, we need this angle here. So here's the right slope angle. We're going to make sure that that's straight. Good. And then we're going to come over here. Now I can measure what Dr. Blair would do, is measure the convergence, the posterior 1/3 of this joint, which is about all we're seeing in this particular case. This is the opposite side convergence angle. So here's the right slope, here's the left convergence. You can see this blue line. We're catching the very end of the convergence angle. Now, many doctors have started using this over here because we can actually see the convergence angle of the right side much clearer, and it's a much more accurate angle. And it doesn't seem to been an experimental thing. I think Dr. Blair just was worried about using too many x-rays, and so that was close enough that we didn't have to take more x-rays to come up with the angle over here. But and just for curiosity, we'll see that this is different. Let's go ahead and measure this over here now. This is not, again, part of the Blair procedure, but just for our interest. So we'll look at this later on the next, when we're measuring the left slope, we'll be looking at the right convergence. We'll see. I'm going to go ahead and take a picture of that. Boom. Oh, except I didn't keep that in there. So let's get this here. Let's shift and click, and now I've got all three angles. So now we're going to take a picture of that. Now we're going to slide over here to the other side. Line that up. Good. Good. Okay. You can see with the thicker slices how it gets a little bit more difficult with the cone beam CT scan to see the actual number. So I'm going to bring this back down to 5. Actually, a lot of times what I'll do after I've gotten these 2 points here in the center screen is I'll go all the way back to in the smallest slice, which in my case is a 0.3. But it gets a little bit harder. I've already set this up, but you can see the other one disappeared. We'd have to move things around to find it. So I'm okay at this point. If you would see it on the thicker one, you could just leave it there. Now again, see that? If I try to pick up that end, it's actually going to start rotating the axes because I've got that circle there. So I'm going to get rid of the axis, pull that way up, and then bring it down. Right, boom. Good, good. I'm going to look at this, posterior 1/3 of the condyle. Let's measure that. Get rid of that. Boom, boom. All right, shift, bring that back in. Let's take a look. Posterior 1/3 of that compared to the ground. $27. Now, 27, I don't remember what the other one was, but we can look later. Let's go ahead and get the axis back in there. Let's take a picture. So that's the left side. Now, what I want to do is I want to take a look at this outside edge. And it was difficult to see with a thicker, but that's how Dr. Blair did it. But you get more resolution on an x-ray, although I'm not sure about the x-rays he was using. They're pretty old. Probably still better than this. So here we are looking at pretty much the full joint. There's a little bit that's not there, but I'm getting all this outside edge. And so I can't really see what's going on here, but since I've already got my measurements, I'm not too scared about actually moving things around. And he would look at these x-rays through the sinus straight down there, and that, because of the curve here, this middle purple line would be more asymptotic, not asymptotic, basically touching that curve, and so you get a little bit better view right in there. And but I can't really see very clearly what's going on there. So let's get rid of that. A nice long styloid process. I'm going to move it back and forth. It looks fairly lined up. Now I'm going to move this. Let's see if I can get a clearer picture. No, not necessarily. Okay. Still looks pretty lined up. Let's take a look. Let's go back here. Now, let's bring this up to here. It's right there, looking there. That's looking quite a bit like an ASL. Now, maybe I'm too far forward. Let's scroll forward. As we go more forward, we're seeing a little bit of an ASL, which we would expect. That still looks like an ASL. Now we're getting back to the very middle of the joint. Looks even. So the point you want is about in here. So I am thinking it's probably an ASL. Now let's do something else. Okay, we're looking at the outside edge of the joint. Yeah, we can change this a little bit. That's not going to change too much when we're on such a thin slice. I'm still thinking, see, that looks even. Sometimes you get more questions. So I would go with either even or an ASL. When I'm looking at the joint, it looks like this is the thick part of the joint. Let's bring this back down to level. We're looking at, yeah, see, that's the very outside of the joint. Create a line just touching it. And we are getting an ASL. So I'm going to say overlap. Okay, let's go back and look at the other side. I'm going to thicken that up just so I can see the, there's one of my dots over there. Let's bring this back down to level. Good. Good. Now this is way up in the front, so let's back it up. Okay, hard to see. Looks like maybe an AS. Let's tilt this like Dr. Blair would. Oh, that's looking a little closer. Let's thin it up. Okay, now we're going to come out here to the edge. Oh, that really looks like one, but maybe we're too far forward. At this point, we don't know. Oops, and now I can't see my convexity angles. So let's bring it here. Let's come up. And that's looking pretty much like an ASR. That's more an ASR than an ASL was on the other side. Okay, now it does look like we're kind of far forward, so I'm going to decrease that convergence angle. We're still getting an ASR. Now what happens if I decide to look straight along the joint there? Again, something that Dr. Blair couldn't do. Still seeing an ASR. So I'm going to take that out because that's not one of the pictures. Oops, I went the other way. Let's go this way. And not the clearest picture, but still obvious. Great. Okay. So I've looked at C1, C2. I've come up with an ASR, ASL. I came up with the angles. What we need to do now is take a look at the lower cervical spine. Here we are over on the left side. And it looks like there's some weird, funky stuff going on there. So let's take some measurements. We're going to go boom, boom, straight out. Let's make sure. Yep, good. Now, instead of having to recheck everybody's straight lines, I'm just going to copy that. There's 2, 3, 4 more joints. So I just did Command C and Command V. Command C once, Command V 4 times. Okay, now we're going to come down. Boom. Remember, it's the superior aspect of the lower bone that we're measuring, because we will be adjusting the upper bone to the lower bone, which is currently how it's done. Okay, now I'm going to hit Shift and select all of them so that when I take my picture, they're all there. Now, a couple different things we can do here. One thing is just to kind of run it back and forth and take a look at the anterior margins. Those do look like a mess, don't they? Even looks like there's possibly that might be finished there, but this, not the best place to look, but is a good secondary place to look. That looks anterior, or lined up if that's an osteophyte. It doesn't really look posterior, but that would give me pause, and it does look like things kind of end right there on the lower one, and then we've got some extra bone going anterior. So that's probably a false positive for a PRI. Up here, we're seeing an anterior wedge in the joint, but the joints do look lined up. Maybe a little bit anterior, but we would expect a posterior wedge. Again, that's a secondary thing. You can have an anterior without having a posterior wedge, or even indeed have an anterior wedge and a posterior. This one down here looks really obvious. So look, this point is back here, this point is here, posterior margin is way posterior. I'm going to call that definitely a PRI, a C2, 3, C4 PRI on C5. And C5 looks similar down here. It's not a smooth, easy joint, but that also looks pretty bad. So let's we're going to find the kind of the best picture or pictures. Take a picture of it. Okay, let's see, he's a little rotated, so we're going to, now let's go look at the other side. Okay, now let's look here. Yeah, I'm actually going to move this out a little bit so we get a smoother, better picture here. I'm going to measure. Copy, paste 1, 2, 3 times, grab them, pop the angle part on the back part of the lower, not the lower joint, but the superior margin of the lower bone. Good. Shift, hold the shift down. Take a screenshot, boom, and those are my measurements for the right side. Now, if I'm just going to go back and forth, nothing going on there. We got an anterior wedge, which would seem to indicate a posteriority, but it doesn't look like a posteriority to me. This one certainly could be a posteriority, not really a wedge, is kind of a deformation of the joint. The posterior aspect of the joint doesn't seem to be posterior, but that can happen. That can just be normal. But it's not too obvious to me, so I'm going to leave it. Here's an anterior wedge, which will indicate possibly a posteriority. Here's a posterior aspect of the posterior, but I'm not seeing a clear margin in here that says posterior. So I'm going to leave that alone for now. Maybe just chalk it up on my maybe mark. And I'm not seeing much going on down here that's very clear. So I could take and do a thicker slice and take a look through there. And there's some interesting things we can do with that. Now 10 millimeters is usually pretty good. Here, let's change the contrast a little bit so I can see better. We can get we can more see more of the hardness of the bone, joint margins, but not really the anterior. Now, one of the things that we can do here, let's come down. What I'm going to do, I really want to get into this, is let's look straight through the joint. Okay, here's the joint. Here's the joint. We're looking at the right one, so I'm going to line that up there. Let's get rid of that. Now I can look through. Okay, we've got an anterior wedge, slight anterior wedge. It does look like maybe there's a slight posteriority right there. I can move this back and forth a little bit just to get a better idea. I'm still not convinced, but it's a possibility. Let's go down to the next one. Computer, good. And let's take a look here. Let's line it up. Got the joint there. This one, this is a deformed one there. Who knows why? I don't. All right. Pretty good. I can tilt it back and forth. Possible posteriority there. Another thing that we can do is we can rotate the joint. And often when I'm looking at the IVFs, I'm looking at this too. That's a distinct possibility for a posteriority. We can just keep on going down and doing that. The other thing that we can do, and I'm going to go back to the, I'm going to go right up here. Let's get this, bring this back to normal. Let's take a look at the IVFs. Sometimes that'll give us a good clue. So I'm going to go straight there. I'm going to go right through the IVF. Now you can see it over there on the right hand side. These, are not curved. Now he didn't have a good curve. It was fairly straight, maybe slightly kyphotic. But looking at these, you can see some differences as well that may give you a clue. I mean, that looks anterior to that. That looks posterior to that. So let's see, C2, C3, did C4 go posterior on C5? Was that one of the things that we could look at that? That might give us an idea to imagine. Now let's come over here and get rid of the cross hairs, and let's just rotate this a little bit. So I'm looking at this where the bodies come together and over here at the joints. We've got some osteophytes down here. Put some osteophytes in there. Another thing we can do is kind of move things around there. We can, if you're really trying to figure something out, usually you don't have to go into this much detail, but let's say we really want to see what's going on there. So let's bring that in. Let's line it up. Let's center it between these two. Get rid of that. Kind of just move back and forth. Yeah. Could be a possibility there's a posteriority there. Let's take this back down to 0.3. The smallest slice. Stick it in the middle. Boom. Make sure those are centered right through there, centered there. Go back and forth. So the lower cervicals for me were always the harder thing to analyze. It was difficult enough doing C1 on C or C0 on C1, and then these lower ones with using the plain film radiography, tough. And now I can do a lot better, but it still raises questions. So anyway, that'll bring us to the end of looking at this, specifically the Blair analysis. We didn't go look at the jaw. We didn't take into account some of the new things that we can do with CT scan in regard to finding the center of the skull and so on and so forth. But that's for another video.